In 1823, the U.S. issued a desperate warning, a strategic gamble that became the primary framework for American influence across the hemisphere. To understand the origin of this policy, we have to look at the geopolitical reality of the time. The young United States was fragile, and the global stage was dominated by aggressive European monarchies. Across the Atlantic, following the defeat of Napoleon, powers like Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France had formed an alliance. Their mission was to crush liberal revolts and restore monarchies, a mission France was actively fulfilling by invading Spain. The fear in Washington was that these same European powers would turn their attention westward and cross the ocean to help Spain reconquer its former colonies in Latin America, which had been breaking away since 1810. At the exact same time, a second threat emerged in the West. Russia was pushing its territorial claims south from Alaska, squeezing American interests along the Pacific coast. The United States was not acting from a position of strength. They were acting out of a fear of being surrounded and choked out by hostile empires. Britain actually offered a solution. For their own commercial reasons, the British wanted to protect their trade with the newly independent Latin American republics. They proposed a joint Anglo-American declaration telling Europe to stay out of the Americas. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams persuaded President James Monroe to reject the British offer and act completely alone. Adams knew that partnering with Britain would tether American foreign policy to the British Empire. A unilateral statement preserved total independence of action for the United States. By choosing to issue this warning as an executive address to Congress rather than signing an international treaty, Adams laid the groundwork for a foreign policy defined by presidential policy rather than international law. Monroe's address rested on three pillars. First, non-colonization, closing the Western Hemisphere to future European empires. Second, non-intervention, warning Europe not to interfere in the Americas' independent political affairs. Third, separation of hemispheres, defining the Americas and Europe as completely distinct political worlds. This declaration had no standing in international law, and in 1823, the U.S. lacked the military power to back up any of these claims. The policy survived because it was implicitly enforced by the British Royal Navy, which used its naval superiority to keep European rivals out of Latin American markets for its own benefit. The Monroe Doctrine began as a massive strategic bluff. It relied on the protection of the very empires it claimed to oppose. By the early 20th century, the United States had acquired the military and economic power necessary to enforce its own rules. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt introduced the most significant expansion of the policy, known as the Roosevelt Corollary. Roosevelt reinterpreted the doctrine, claiming the United States had the right to militarily intervene in Latin American countries to prevent European powers from doing so, to collect debts. This logic justified a chain of U.S. military occupations across Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. These interventions triggered resentment among Latin American nations, who realized they had never been consulted when the policy was first written. A doctrine created to protect the Americas from foreign empires was now being used to build an American empire in its place. There was a brief attempt to soften this approach in the 1930s with Franklin D. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, which renounced unilateral intervention. The Cold War revived and mutated the doctrine yet again. The threat was no longer European monarchs, but communist penetration. This new logic was first applied in 1954 to justify the CIA-backed overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz's government in Guatemala. It fueled the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. And during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy explicitly invoked Monroe Doctrine principles to block Soviet expansion in the Caribbean. This thinking persisted through the 1980s interventions in Nicaragua and the invasion of Grenada in 1983. The doctrine proved remarkably flexible. By swapping out the identity of the enemy, the U.S. maintained a justification to police the Western Hemisphere. Looking back at its long-term impact, the Monroe Doctrine successfully fractured global power. It carved out an exclusive American sphere of influence while sidelining European powers in the region. It also created the blueprint for American unilateralism. It normalized the practice of using presidential policy to dictate the sovereignty of weaker neighbors. In 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over, attempting to pivot U.S. rhetoric toward partnership. The Monroe Doctrine persists as a living political idea, the ideological scaffolding of American power. Its legacy remains inseparable from both the independence of Latin America and the history of U.S. dominion over it.